Yeah, so first I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming out and for supporting us. This is obviously the first Illuminations lecture of the 2014-15 academic year. Thanks to Patrick Hoberg and Donovan Irvin for organizing, and of course, thanks to Dr. Ronald Bogue for joining us. Ronald Bogue received his BA in Comparative Literature at USC in California, and went on to do his PhD in Comparative Literature at the University of Oregon. He is currently the Distinguished Research Professor and Josiah Meigs, I hope I said that correctly. No? Megs, thank you. Sorry. Distinguished Teaching Professor of Comparative Literature, and as of this year, Professor Emeritus at the University of Georgia. The author of numerous awards, or excuse me, numerous articles and books. I'm working off, look, pencil on paper. But some of his books, which you guys may know, Deleuze and Guattari from 1989, and then part of a series, Deleuze on Cinema, Deleuze on Literature, and Deleuze on Music, Painting, and the Arts from 2003. And then briefly, I just had two remarks. One, I wanted to say that I think that Dr. Bogue is the perfect type of speaker, and this type of paper is really perfect for what we do here with the Illuminations lecture series, and hopefully in the philosophy and literature program. I think it really speaks to the interdisciplinary nature of our program and to the Illuminations lecture series. On a personal note, I think for people that are working on Deleuze and literature, trying to infuse their literary criticism or understanding of modernist literature or poetry, as the case may be, with Deleuzian theory, I think that Dr. Bogue's work is really indispensable and invaluable, so it's an honor to have him here. And lastly, I'll just say that I think we have a very special opportunity here at Purdue to study Deleuze. Numerous dissertations in the philosophy department, philosophy and literature program, professional conferences, including the recent Logic, Mathematics, and Philosophy conference. Some of the papers focused on Deleuze. And over the years, many of the things we've done in the philosophy and literature program, graduate conferences, Illuminations lectures, and I have to mention there is currently a rather lively Deleuze reading group taking place on Tuesdays. So I see tonight's talk as another instance in what I think is a very strong tradition of Deleuze studies here at Purdue, which I think I speak for many of us, so I'm very proud to be a part of. The title of tonight's paper is Deleuze Protocols of Experience in the Experimental Novel, if that's in fact the correct title, which I read off his printout there. But I ask you to please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Ronald Bogue from the University of Georgia.
Well, I'd like to wait until the handout is distributed before I begin my remarks. It's not entirely useful in that there are a few things in here that will be helpful during the talk. There are some other things I had hoped this could have been distributed several minutes ahead of time so you have something to read. It's not a good idea to have a handout that includes material that's not in the talk. I think it gives you a chance to do something in case you get really bored. You can just look it over and work through it. But I'm going to talk about this concept of protocols of experience, or protocol d'expérience, singular or plural. It's a motif in Deleuze that is not particularly prominent, and even less so if you read Deleuze only in English translation. And I think you'll see along the way that this phrase is translated at different times in different ways, such that you'd never guess there is this phrase. And there are variations thereof. But I've given you the four passages in which the phrase itself, protocol d'expérience, either singular or plural, is used in Deleuze's work. As far as I know, these are the only four places that this occurs. The next thing on your handout will be of some use to you. I'm going to talk about Louis Wolfson and his experimental language, and also Graham Rossetti, and Deleuze will talk about this directly. So that will be a direct use to you. On the back of the page, you'll see foresee, processus, procédé, and procédure. these are words that are foresee is the trial in Kafka is called the foresee, based on process. The German, I mean, as based on that, as is the case in German, but it can also mean process besides trial. And Deleuze and Guattari often play on both meanings of trial and process. There's also this word processus, which means process, which means progress or course or method of operation. Deleuze will talk about procédé, procedure, or a proceeding, but in some ways it's close to the notion of a process. And then there is this word procédure, which is a procedure or legal proceedings. And I won't be talking about procédure, but I did want to give you an example of what I would say is a case for the necessity of studying comparative literature. Deleuze and Guattari have an interesting reading of the trial, in which they use all four of those words, procès, processus, procédé, and procédure. And they say, Kafka himself said it. Well, Kafka's translator said it. And if you look at the original passage they are basing it on, that's what you get at first in the German translation, I mean the German original. And then I gave the Willa and Edward Nur translation, and then the Brion Michael translation, and then I gave the French translation, and as you'll see, the French translation invents quite a bit. There is no reason to use all four of those words, and that's the basis for Deleuze and Guattari's interpretation. I just thought that was kind of interesting because a lot of the question of procès and processus will come up, and I didn't have time to talk about this. Probably already wasted too much time talking here, but if you'd like to talk about it after I get done, I find it fascinating, and actually I can make sense of what Deleuze and Guattari are saying at the bottom. And then the last thing, I will make reference to portions of this this section, which I've excerpted to some extent from what is philosophy. So that will be germane to what we're doing. Okay, my object today is to consider Deleuze's approach to literature via what Deleuze calls protocols of experience, a minor term in his vocabulary, but one whose explication helps reveal the fundamental elements of his conception of the art of literature. For Deleuze, linguistics is a subdivision of pragmatics, and language is a mode of action inseparable from discursive and non-discursive formations of power, themselves inextricable from their material components. Language operates within assemblages of words, ideas, representations, institutions, objects, artifacts, and organisms that ultimately admit of no absolute distinction from one another. Literature is simply a specific mode of language action. Hence, Deleuze insists that no differentiation should be made between a writer's life and works, and that writing is a means of intervening in the real. Literature is both critical and clinical, its critical function being that of diagnosing the diseases of society, its clinical function that of initiating new possibilities for life. Literature intervenes in the world by resisting the intolerable, which in negotiations Deleuze identifies as death, slavery, infamy, shame. It resists the intolerable by undoing repressive codes and destabilizing asymmetrical power relations. Its interventions seek no predetermined cure, however. Their aim instead is to open the future to new modes of existence, the precise nature of which cannot be determined ahead of time. Literature is a form of experimentation, which seeks through its interventions in the real to invoke a people to come, but which has no guarantee of success. It is this notion of literature as experimentation that informs Deleuze's use of the term protocols of experience. That's really, I should have used about 40 minutes to get through all of that, but that's to set up where I want to go. As far as I can determine, the phrase protocols of experience occurs only 4 times in Deleuze's writing. We've got the 4 of them. First in Kafka, Toward a Mind of Literature, in 1975. Next in Dialogue in 1977. And then twice in 1,000 Plateaus, 1980. In 1,000 Plateaus, the French protocole d'expérience is translated as protocols of experience at one point, but protocole d'expérience is rendered elsewhere as the protocol of an experiment. The differing translations of experience, of expérience, are legitimate since expérience can mean both experience and experiment, and the double meaning of the word is significant. The word protocol has various meanings, of course. A set of rules dictating behavior in formal situations, a document detailing the terms of a treaty or formal agreement between 2 countries, a list of specific measures of a medical course of treatment, and a plan for a scientific experiment. The conjunction of protocole and expérience thus suggests that Deleuze is using protocol primarily in the sense of a plan for a scientific experiment. Experimentation itself is an important theme in Deleuze's later works, first making its appearance in the exposition of his transcendental empiricism, Indifference and Repetition, in 1968, at least as far as I've been able to tell. There, Deleuze argues that Kant's focus on the conditions of possible experience necessarily leads to a bifurcation of the aesthetic into the realm of sensible experience on one hand and the realm of the arts on the other, such that, quote, the theory of the sensible captures only the real's conformity with possible experience, whereas, end quote, the theory of the beautiful brings together the reality of the real insofar as it is reflected elsewhere, end quote. By contrast, in Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, which seeks the conditions of real experience, quote, the 2 senses of the aesthetic become one, to the point where the being of the sensible reveals itself in the work of art, while at the same time the work of art appears as experimentation. Art, then, is experimentation. What it experiments on is the sensible or real experience, and what it reveals is the being of the sensible. And I could probably, if I were capable, spend the next 40 minutes talking about that. But moving right along, in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari touch again on art as experimentation during their discussion of desiring production as open-ended process, processus. In modernity, they say, art reaches a breakthrough, that art as a process, processus, without goal, but that attains completion as such. When artists abandon meanings and aims, sans but, art accedes to its authentic modernity, they say, which simply consists in liberating what was present from its beginnings, what was hidden underneath aims and objects, even its aesthetic, and underneath recordings and axiomatics. The pure process, processes again, that fulfills itself and that never ceases to reach fulfillment as it proceeds, en tant que possède, which is of course another one of those words from the processus stuff, art as experimentation. So a process, a movement is one with experimentation in art. To the final word, experimentation, they add a footnote citing John Cage's remark that, and this is Cage's words, the word experimental is apt, providing it is understood not as descriptive of an act to be later judged in terms of success and failure, but simply as of an act the outcome of which is unknown. Deleuze and Guattari also give as instances of modern experimentation l'expérience arto, l'expérience Burroughs, translated as the Arto experiment, the Burroughs experiment, and then you can see the expérience experiment translation. Right? Experimentation receives considerable stress in Kafka, Toward a Mind of Literature, and here protocols of experience, translated as tests of experience, appears for the first time. So if you were reading that book and you wonder where was protocols of experience, you wouldn't find it. You find tests of experience. Okay. After rejecting psychoanalytic, hermeneutical, and structural interpretations of Kafka, Deleuze and Guattari state, and here's your first quote, and I think I quote all of it here, We believe only in a Kafka politics that is neither imaginary nor symbolic. We believe only in one or more Kafka machines that are neither structure nor phantasm. We believe only in a Kafka experimentation that is without interpretation and signification and rests only on protocols of experience. That's my modified translation. A writer, they say, is not a writer man, he is a political man, a machine man, an experimental man. When Deleuze and Guattari discuss the trial in terms of machinic assemblages, they say that the characteristics of Kafka's novelistic machinic assemblage, quote, impose not an interpretation or a social representation of Kafka, but an experimentation, a socio-political protocol. So there, that's not protocol d'expérience, but it is a use of that word. And in the English translation, it is a social political investigation. So again, protocol disappears in translation. I will use Deleuze and Guattari's Kafka as the framework for the rest of my discussion. But before considering further what they mean in Kafka by experimentation, protocols of experience, and a socio-political protocol, I would like to remark briefly on Deleuze's preface to Louis Wolfson's The Schizo and Languages, The Schizo et les Langues, which first appeared in 1970 and then was published in a much revised version as Louis Wolfson or the Procedure in Deleuze's last book, Essays, Critical and Clinical, 1993. So it was originally a preface to this book by Louis Wolfson. Wolfson's book provides a third-person account of himself as, in his own words, the student of schizophrenic language, the mentally ill student, he calls himself, the student of demented idioms. Those are three self-characterizations, who fends off his mother and his maternal tongue, that would be American English, by developing elaborate mental operations to undo and deform English and create new sentences in an amalgam of sonic and or semantic equivalents of the English sentence drawn from French, German, Russian, or Hebrew. That description may not be real clear, but the example will be. And this is your first example from Louis Wolfson. What it is his mother's talking to him, and he's frantically trying all the time to get her to escape the invasive force of that mother tongue, of that mother assaulting him. And so whenever she says anything in English, he immediately translates it furiously into this sort of macaronic hodgepodge of things. And here's an example. Don't trip over the wire. And the example he is tu nicht, German, trébucher, French, über, German, fke, which is Hebrew, sphere. So he says to himself, tu nicht trébucher, über, that's right, sphere. I've tried to find one that had the Russian in it too, but this is one that Deleuze cites. And so this is an example of a kind of let's see here. Okay. In his 1970 preface to this book by Wolfson, Deleuze praises Wolfson for inventing such operations, as this kind of a translation, which Deleuze calls procedures, foresee, saying that one of the great originalities of this book is to be a protocol of activities or occupations. In the 1993 version of the text, Deleuze praises Wolfson for setting forth, quote, a protocol of experimentation, protocol d'expérimentation ou d'activité. Okay, so a protocol of experimentation or activity. Deleuze finds Wolfson's practices similar to those of the novelist Raymond Roussel, who developed narratives through slight modifications of germinal sentences. And this is your example from Roussel, and anyone who's studied Roussel, these are very famous. Sur les bandes du vieux billard, which can be translated as the white letters on the cushions of the old billiard table, is changed with just one letter to les lettres du blanc sur les bandes du vieux pillard, which could be interpreted as the white man's letters about the gangs of the old plunderer. You can see. And so he takes those two and he says, okay, I'll write a narrative that will somehow make it such that these two sentences will generate a fiction. Or another way he worked was by creating a single sentence homonymous, single sentence homonymous fragments that he, out of a single sentence with homonymous fragments, that he subsequently incorporated into a narrative. For example, j'ai du bon tabac, j'ai du bon tabac dans ma tabatière. It's a children's song. And he takes j'ai du bon tabac, I have good tobacco, and he reads j'ai de tube au bad, or j'ai de tube wave morning sun song. And then he says, okay, I'll make a fiction out of that. Okay. Wolfson's book, however, unlike a novel by Roussel, is not a literary work or a work of art, nor does it claim to be so. That's in the 1970 preface of Deleuze's. It doesn't show up in the 1993 version. Roussel's procedures lead to texts unrelated to the circumstances of their creation, whereas Wolfson's procedures remain tied to the specific situation in which he finds himself, and hence they lack aesthetic autonomy. In 1993, Deleuze articulates this difference between Wolfson and Roussel by saying, the transformations never reach the grandiose level of an event, but remain mired in their accidental circumstances. The procedure thus remains a protocol. The first time I talked about protocols of experience, somebody said, well, what about the Wolfson thing? It says their protocols are bad. Well, only in 1993. Back in 1970, it was okay. So, in the 1970 text, however, Deleuze does not oppose procedure and protocol, but instead equates protocol and procedure as foresee, distinguishing Wolfson from Roussel via their respective uses of procedures. One sense of a literary protocol, then, is that of a procedure or set of procedures whereby one experiments on linguistic elements, letters, sounds, meanings, deforming them and then reassembling them in new ways. In Kafka, Toward Minor Literature, Deleuze and Guattari assert that such linguistic experimentation is present in Kafka's use of German, which they labor at minor usage, facilitated by German's status as a deracinated paper language in Prague, and by Kafka's exposure to Czech, Hebrew, and Yiddish speech and idioms. And native speakers of German with whom I've consulted say they think they are absolutely wrong about this, that it doesn't work. It's a nice theory anyway. Yet Deleuze and Guattari give no specific examples of such linguistic deterritorialization, focusing instead on other forms of experimentation in Kafka. Deleuze and Guattari divide Kafka's writing into three groups: the letters, the short stories, and the novels. In all three forms, Kafka's problem is to avoid closure and keep his literary machine running. In the letters, noticeably those to his fiancée Felice, the danger is that his exchanges will lead to marriage, and hence to an end of the correspondence. And Kafka fears to an end of his activity as a writer altogether. If he ever gets married, he'll never be able to be a writer, so he's always pushing this marriage off. Hence, his strategy is to ward off conjugality and perpetuate an endless correspondence through the imposition of obstacles to any physical meeting with Felice. Here's Deleuze-Guattari. The horror of Kafka toward all forms of conjugality, a prodigious operation by which he translates this horror into a topography of obstacles. Where to go? How to arrive? Prague? Vienna? Berlin? So where should we meet? What should we do? So, the surveyor, and also the other operation by which he enumerates a numbered list of conditions that the subject of the statement thinks can dissipate horror when, in fact, it is this very horror in the subject of enunciation that inspires them. And in parentheses, Deleuze-Guattari say, program or life plan a la Kleist. The relationship between these operations, operation, remember now we've got processus, we've got experimentation, we've got protocols, we've got procédés or proceedings or procedures, now we've got operations, and now we're getting program or life plan that seem to be hooked into this notion of protocols. The relationship between operation and experimental protocols is made clear in Deleuze's 1977 dialogue, and that's your second quote, and I think I give you more than I actually provide in this talk, but maybe you can find it in there, where he speaks of Kafka and Kleist passing their time drawing up programs for life. If Kafka is forever composing programs of obstacles and numbered conditions, Kleist, in his early correspondence with his sister, speaks repeatedly of his need for a Leben, a life plan. And if you read, he's like 21, 22, and Deleuze claims this is not anything to do with your usual idea of having a plan for life. I think he's wrong. I think Kleist was talking in a very immature kind of way, saying, oh, I need some kind of a plan for my life, to his sister. But there's another kind of a deformation that Deleuze sometimes reads literary works. Deleuze argues that neither Kafka nor Kleist is attempting to map the future in a fixed way. Rather, each is using a program or life plan to live an experimental life, to engage in a, quote, life experimentation, end quote. A life program as mode of experimentation is, and here's the phrase, quote, always modified in the process of coming into being, betrayed in the process of being hollowed out, like riverbanks that branch off or canals that are arranged in order that a flux may flow. Life programs or plans are, and here's a quote, finite processes, and here's foresee, of experimentation, protocols of experience. Here's another usage of the term, which serve as, and here's the phrase I find most significant, and it is in italics in the dialogues, means of providing reference points for an experimentation which exceeds our capacities to foresee. In Kafka's letters, then, we find something like the procedures of Wolfson and Roussel, specific techniques or opérations, exercised in language. These operations, however, are also components of programs, plans, sets of obstacles, numbered lists of conditions, which function as reference points for experimentation. In this sense, such protocols outline a set of future operations, but only as the basis of an improvisatory process of constant adjustment of the plan as experimentation continues. And most important, these protocols of experience do not have linguistic deformation as their goal. They are meant instead to have the real-world effect of keeping Felice at a distance. Deleuze and Guattari deal with Kafka's short stories, moving to the next unit here, primarily as stories of animal metamorphosis, or what they call becoming animal. When they say that the writer is an experimental man, they add parenthetically that he is one, quote, who thereby ceases to be a man in order to become an ape or a beetle or a dog or a mouse, a becoming animal, a becoming inhuman, end quote. Such becoming animal, they assert, is not metaphorical, symbolic, or allegorical, but real. Not that people magically become beetles or dogs, rather a process of becoming other passes between the categories of the human and the animal, such that a new ahuman mode of being opens up through the metamorphic interrelation of the two via a line of flight, a vector of deterritorialization. The stories, Deleuze and Guattari say, quote, attaining to the real, writing themselves within the real itself, are nonetheless caught up in the tension between two opposing poles or realities. Becoming animal effectively shows a way out, traces a line of flight. The two opposing poles, I assume, to be the human and the animal, and a way to get past those categories. Becoming animal is also, quote, a map of intensities. It is an ensemble of states, each distinct from the other, grafted onto the man insofar as he is searching for a way out. It is a creative line of flight that means nothing other than itself, end quote. Becoming animal is but one of several forms of becoming other, becoming woman, becoming child, becoming molecular, becoming imperceptible, and so on. Central to becoming other is experimentation, which Deleuze associates with Spinoza's observation that we do not know what a body can do. In Spinoza, Practical Philosophy of 1970, revised in 1981, Deleuze says that on the great plane of immanence of nature, each thing, whether natural or artificial, living or non-living, is defined by its affects, that is, its powers of affecting and being affected, and by its differential speeds. Spinoza's ethics, according to Deleuze, is an ethology, a study that defines, quote, bodies, animals, or humans by the affects they are capable of. The approach approach is no less valid for us, for human beings, than for animals, because no one knows ahead of time the affects one is capable of. It is a long affair of experimentation. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari address experimentation on the body. First in Plateau 6, how do you make yourself a body without organs? That's the title of that plateau. Then in Plateau 10, titled Becoming Intense, Becoming Animal, Becoming Imperceptible, ... The body without organs is roughly the same as the plane of immanence, and I'm being really rough here, but gotta move along. A deterritorialized dimension of nothing but affective intensities and differential speeds. The body without organs is a limit that is never fully reached, but approaching that limit can only take place via experimentation. The body without organs, Deleuze and Guattari say, quote, is not a concept, but a practice, pratique, a set of practices, an ensemble de pratique. The hypochondriac, the schizophrenic, the drug addict, and the masochist experiment on their bodies, trying to make a body without organs with varying degrees of success or failure. Each is engaged in a set of practices, a program, like that of the masochist who enumerates the operations the dominatrix is asked to perform on his body. Tie me to a table, whip me 100 times, sew up this orifice, burn that organ, and so on. Carlos Castaneda, who writes of his experiences with the Mexican sorcerer Don Juan, is also making a body without organs when he follows the various stages in his training in sorcery. Castaneda's books, Deleuze and Guattari say, are less an ethnographical study than a protocol of experience, and that's my third quote there. I give you much more than I can give you here. All these efforts to make a body without organs proceed via processes of becoming other, and in Plateau 10, Deleuze and Guattari provide further details of becoming other, all of which involve experimentation on the body and tend toward the body without organs or the plane of consistency. In this plateau, they speak of Henri Michaud's experimentations with drugs as, and there's your fourth one, minute protocols of experience. It is clear in this plateau that all becomings, including Kafka's Becoming Animal, are experiments connected to sets of practices, to protocols of experience. Kafka's letters then employ the protocols of programs, life plans, sets of obstacles, lists of conditions. And his short stories engage protocols of becoming other, especially becoming animal. To these protocols, the novels add practices much more clearly political than those in the letters and stories. Paradigmatic among the novels in this regard is the trial, the foresee in French. Kafka's fundamental goal, according to Deleuze and Guattari, is to perpetuate active desire, desiring production in the terminology of anti-Oedipus, and avoid any closure in such desiring. Desire, they say, is, quote, not form, but possession, foresee. And in the trial, Kafka explores the law as desire, converting the foresee as court proceeding into a foresee as open-ended process of experimentation. We will recall that in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari characterized modern art as the pure process, processus, that fulfills itself and that never ceases to reach fulfillment as it proceeds, en tant que procède, art as experimentation. The fundamental operation or procedure of the trial is, quote, to extract from social representations assemblages of enunciation and machinic assemblages and to dismantle these assemblages, end quote. And then again, writing has this double function, they say, transcribe into assemblages, dismantle assemblages. Such transcription and demolition, they say, is a procedure, procédé, much more intense than any critique, quote. And then again, the trial is not an interpretation or a social representation, but an experimentation, a socio-political protocol. There we get the third. So we have the protocol notion in the letters, in the short stories, and now in the novels. The application of this procedure takes place through Joseph K, or Joseph K, who is less a character than a function, the K function, as refers to it in dialogues. At each stage of the narrative, as representations are converted into assemblages, K produces an experimental dismantling, which then leads to another stage, and then another, the sequence following no predetermined plan, episode after episode, exploring the law as repressive institution and converting it into an imminent line of desiring production. Through this socio-political protocol, Kafka neither interprets nor represents reality, but instead experiments directly on the real, and in so doing uncovers not simply the material power structures and processes in effect in Kafka's present, but also the diabolical powers of the future. It's supposedly from Kafka, it's not quite clear, it's in the French translation. Immanent within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Guattari identifies those as those of Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, and American capitalism. These diabolical powers of the future are metastable potentialities that are being actualized in the present, yet that have the possibility of other actualizations, both negative and positive. For this reason, Kafka's disclosures of imminent forces of the future are always double-edged, revealing both diabolical powers to come and the revolutionary forces to be constructed. For Deleuze, writing is experimentation, an intervention in the real meant to produce something new. In this regard, literature involves not only formal aesthetic experimentation, but also something like social scientific experimentation. This association of literature with science cannot help but bring to mind Zola's essay, The Experimental Novel, which calls for the development of the novel as an experimental science. The differences between Deleuze's and Zola's conceptions of literary experimentation are significant, but helpful in clarifying Deleuze's thought. Zola organizes his essay around, that is the experimental novel, around Claude Bernard's introduction to the study of experimental medicine, arguing that just as medicine is becoming less an intuitive art and more an experimental science, so literature should abandon its rhapsodic and metaphysical intuitions and embrace the scientific method. Bernard notes that medical experimentation is more complicated than experimentation in physics and chemistry, since it involves milieus both external and internal to humans, yet nonetheless it is a feasible and necessary enterprise. Zola admits that literature's domain is even more complex than that of medicine, in that it includes social milieus as well as those of the physical and the physiological environment, but such complexity, Zola argues, should not deter writers from developing literature as an experimental science that, like medicine, will extend the range of human knowledge. Says Zola, we have experimental chemistry and medicine, we shall have an experimental physiology, and later on, an experimental knowledge. In the novel's field of experimentation will not be the physiological body, but, he says, the passionate and intellectual acts of man. Experimental novelists, Zola explains, choose a set of characters in their environment, develop a hypothesis of how the characters might react under certain circumstances, induce a modification of the social situation, and then observe the results of that modification. As Zola says, the idea of experiment carries with it the idea of modification, and we must modify nature without departing from nature when we employ the experimental method in our novels. Once a given experiment is completed, the novelist deduces the natural laws that govern the character's behavior. Zola argues, however, that the discovery of such deterministic laws does not lead to fatalism, since humans can use knowledge of these laws to act and thereby further modify their situation. Experimental novelists are experimental moralists, he says, and in our role as experimental moralists, we show the mechanism of the useful and the useless. We disengage the determinism of the human and social phenomena so that, in their turn, the legislators can one day pull the country toward that great object, the conquest of nature and the increase of man's power 100-fold. He was very much a utopian kind of idealist. Among the many problems with Zola's concept of the experimental novel, two are particularly striking. First, Zola ignores the fact that the writer's imaginary laboratory is qualitatively different from the scientist's material laboratory, and in no way subject to the constraints of factual and counterfactual verifiability, fundamental to legitimate experimentation in the sense that he uses it. And second, Zola leaves unexplained how scientific determinism accommodates the free will necessary for humans to conquer nature and create an ideal world. And here I'm being unfair to Zola. Elsewhere, he does address this and has this concept of immediate, which is a sort of weird way out of, that gets him free will without actual free will. But that's for somewhere else. Okay. Since language, Deleuze addresses both these problems. Since language is a mode of action, there is no separation between art and life, fiction and the world. That question that he never addressed, of the difference between an experiment in the lab versus an experiment in a novel. Like Zola, Deleuze conceives of experimentation as modification, and that's what I found interesting, as an intervention in which writers, in Zola's words, modify nature without departing from nature. But the aim of such intervention is not the discovery of scientific laws for Deleuze. Indeed, nature, as Deleuze conceives it, is not deterministic but probabilistic. It is a chaosmos of nonlinear systems far from equilibrium, dissipative structures, strange attractors, metastable states, and emergent phenomena. And literary experiments are meant to test potentials and instigate unpredictable modifications of the chaosmos. For this reason, Deleuze has no difficulty in reconciling literature as experimental method and as activist politics, since his is not a deterministic world and the results of any experimental intervention can never be known in advance. Zola likens the experimental novelist to the experimental doctor, the one diagnosing social wounds and disease, the other corporeal ailments, and both finding cures through their scientific investigations. Deleuze, too, links medicine and literature, affirming Nietzsche's designation of writers as civilization's doctors. This is Deleuze quoting Nietzsche in Negotiations. Unlike Zola's experimental novelist, however, the Deleuzean experimental writer seeks no specific cure, but merely a way, quote, to free life from what imprisons it, end quote, and open possibilities for new uncharted modes of existence. Whereas Zola's aim is to make literature a science, Deleuze seeks only to appropriate certain scientific practices for discretely literary ends. Indeed, in What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari make a sharp differentiation among philosophy, science, and the arts, arguing that each has its own provenance and purpose. Yet all three, they claim, have a common goal, that of summoning forth a people to come. And it is in this regard that I find the concept of protocols of experience most suggestive. I have identified various literary protocols of experience, ranging from Wolfson's and Roussel's linguistic procedures, to Kleist's life plans and Kafka's programs of obstacles and enumerated conditions, to masochistic programs, Castaneda's training regimens, and Michaud's controlled exploration of drugs, to various becomings, becoming woman, becoming child, becoming animal, becoming imperceptible, and to the socio-political operations whereby Kafka transcribes representations into assemblages, dismantles them, and discloses the immanent forces of potential futures. In all these cases, protocols serve as means of providing reference points for an experimentation which exceeds our capacities to foresee. That's the italicized passage that I said I found most significant. What I would argue is that this conception of protocols as means of providing reference points for experimentation points toward a basic political practice informing Deleuze's conception of philosophy, science, and the arts. To utilize protocols of experience entails the following. This is sort of basic breakdown here. 1, to assess the present configuration of powers that imprison life and identify those points most susceptible to modification. 2, to develop specific protocols, plans, programs, procedures, practices, and so on to guide a future experimental intervention. 3, to implement those protocols in an experimental intervention in a given situation. 4, to evaluate the results of the experiment and determine the extent to which it has or has not furthered the goal of inventing a people to come, and 5, to reassess the new post-experimentation configuration of powers that imprison life and commence another round of experimentation guided by protocols of experience appropriate to the new situation. In other words, an ongoing process of kind of a trial and error movement towards something. Philosophers, scientists, and artists develop protocols of experience in divergent fashions, but they do so to face a common problem. Their shared goal, and now we're entering sort of the territory of the final quotation. Their shared goal is to invoke a people to come, yet they cannot produce such a people on their own, nor can they know in advance what such a collectivity would be. Their project is utopian, but only in a certain sense. In what is philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari say, utopia is not a good concept. Their reasoning being that utopias are usually complete blueprints of an ideal world, which inevitably project into the future the limitations of the present. Hence, they argue that if one must use the concept of utopia, one must distinguish between authoritarian utopias or utopias of transcendence and, on the other hand, immanent, revolutionary, libertarian utopias. And I don't think they mean our sense of libertarianism. The former are utopias as completed future products. The latter are utopias as processes. Philosophy, science, and the arts have resistance in common. Quote Deleuze and Guattari, resistance to death, to the intolerable, to shame, and to the present. And in all these domains, to create is to resist, they say. In all three, to think is to experiment, but experimentation is always that which is in the process of coming about, the new, remarkable, and interesting. Quote. How then should one proceed in resistance to the presence, in the present, in a utopian process of experimentation, if there is no fixed goal to orient one's action, not haphazardly? And that's my big point here. It's not just blow up everything. It is, there is a practical kind of method for doing this kind of politics without a clear, already pre-established goal. So, not haphazardly, but through protocols of experience, reference points for an experimentation which exceeds our capacities to foresee. The protocols of experience that I have detailed are those used by writers to invoke people to come. They are specific to the art of literature, but the fundamental process of experimentation that underlies them may be applied to philosophy and science as well. In philosophy, science, and the arts, protocols of experience serve as guidelines for movement from an intolerable present to an unknowable future. You want to take first?
Sure.
All right.
So first, thank you. I thought your thesis was very attractive, language as being pragmatic action. My first question is about translation. So not only because Deleuze places an emphasis on how Kafka and Wolfson are using their mother tongue, so to speak, but also because there's points during your paper where you seem to be taking issue with other people's translations. That's why protocols of experience doesn't crop up, or maybe mistranslations of Kafka in the French. But in short, I'm wondering what you think about translation as a site for protocols of experience. Does that go too far? Is it threatening too much? Or is that a place where we can experiment?
Well, obviously, the field of translation is wide open, and there's all sorts of theories of translation and conferences on translation. My interest was very specific. That is, if you're reading Deleuze in English translation, you need to know what words he is repeating. I have proposed a new translation of Deleuze's Foucault, and I'm waiting for a publisher to tell me whether that's a go or not. Because, to me, it's an abysmal translation. Because singularity or singular points show up as particular point, singular point. I forget, there's like 4 or 5 different. You read the book and you can't Now that's different from, say, giving a rendering of Proust. To me, it seems to me, maybe it's not, I don't know, but I think there are works where it's appropriate to translate experience as experience, and in another place as experimentation. And it's not particularly, I don't think a lot is lost in Anti-Oedipus when it is said the Burroughs experiment, the Artaud experiment. I think the idea is there. It happens that when I got interested in this question, it was interesting to go back and see its experience. And the whole point, I think, is that it's an experiment on experience. That those two are, that is an experiment on the real. And I'm using experience in a real loose sense here. So, but as far as a theory of translation goes, you have to think, you want to render in target language something that is the equivalent of the experience in the original language. And the further you get away from the target language, the more difficult that gets. My department, we're the Department for Asian and African Languages, as well as comparative literature. And so we have people working Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Swahili, Yoruba, Zulu, Hindi, and there are just no conflicts in translation. Obviously, it would be often a wrong translation to translate the same word the same into English. You would distort the way language is used. I mean, it is the case that many words have more than one meaning. But in the case of Deleuze, I feel that he is very careful with his vocabulary, and that you miss a lot if you don't know that word protocol is showing up. Besides the four protocol d'expérience, there are 4 or 5 other uses of the term. And incidentally, all of this, the one text I really wish I could have talked about was Bartleby, or the formula, where Deleuze talks about Bartleby's, I would prefer not to, as a formula, which is an interesting thing. Because, of course, you can think of that as a kind of a set statement, a formulaic expression. But you can also think of it in terms of a kind of a mathematical scientific formula. I don't know if it has all that much. But later on in the essay, he says, it is like a procedure, but it's like a procedure reduced to its minimum. It's not like the procedure of Wilson or of Roussel. Instead, it's just a single word, but it is repeated over and over again. And each time it is repeated, more and more of the social world gets deterritorialized or upset. And of course, you end with him in prison, which is people are puzzled about in Deleuze's reading of the thing, saying that Bartleby is a model of political action. And then they say, well, it looks to me like it's a kind of a pacifist quietism of sorts, a resistance that doesn't lead to anything other than a dead end. But I just digressed. I don't know what that has to do with the translation. But at any rate, if I were to finish this, I've actually got more versions of this, and the 4th version would have the Bartleby business in it as being another example of this. But there, I would have to hook it in with this notion of literality. Deleuze people probably know about Zola Micheli's thing about literality. Deleuze opens the essay by saying that Bartleby is speaking literally when he says, I prefer not to, à la lettre. And he says that every reader who reads it must read it literally. And there's a whole business about what is meant by literality. What it means ultimately is neither literal nor figural, or that is against metaphor, and reaching a point where the proper and the metaphorical are indistinguishable. And that is writing literally, where the words become an intensive force that is doing something within a situation where word and thing and proper and figurative and all these others get confused as a kind of, as I said, an intervention.
I'm more than satisfied.
I don't know.
And that exceeded the question that you were given.
No, let's call it digression. Or talking about what I want to talk about. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk. Curious about some of the wider implications of what you were articulating, and one of the things I flashed on was Foucault's turn in his later seminars to ascesis and to his studies of ancient forms of ascesis and spiritual practice, and trying to invent new forms of subjectivity. And I was wondering, is there a relation there, or
Yeah.
would that be
It's
not a
chapter
good way
5
to look at it?
of Deleuze's book on Foucault. That's where he talks about this stuff and about the art of the self and inventing new modes of existence and ways of living. And that's where it gets into this notion of the self as a whole, the outside and the inside. And to me, that's folding in this kind of what unpredictable, open, metastable, virtual set of, I don't know, potentialities is the right word, but of multiple possibilities that can emerge. And that would be the art of forming a self as a kind of a projected process of opening, or rather, setting life free from that which imprisons it. And that would be the individual level of it. But it's right there. And this whole business of possibilities of life and new modes of existence, I think, is a relatively late motif. At least I think that's so. Is that correct?
I don't really know.
To me, it only shows up in cinema books, and then especially in literature and life, in essays, critical and clinical. I'm intrigued by that. I had heard a guy, a Brazilian, who was saying for him, modes of existence and ways of living are different. And he wants to develop those in terms of Surreal's notion of modes of existence, and then ways of living as something within there, which is intriguing to me. I don't know what he's talking about. But it sounds exciting. So, as a footnote. Yes, Dan.
Well, it's just following up on what you said. I thought it was a brilliant talk. I've never really noticed all of these themes that you've tied together here. But I have a question on reference points, like what that means for Deleuze, especially in the creative sense, because I can see like, yeah, but like in experiment, I see, well, you have to, isolate variables and have your instrumentation in a scientific experiment. But then in like psychotic or neurotic, experience, someone who, like I know people with ADHD, and they have protocols how to concentrate. And like you turn off all the lights except the one light on your desk, and put on a music that helps you to focus. Like protocols to get over this, or obsessive compulsive people. You have a protocol. I'm going to wash my hands one more time, and then take another shower, and rearrange my books for the 1,000th time. It's a protocol just of experience, really, just to calm you down or to. But points of reference, I think that's what he's saying about Wolfson, like his protocol. My mother speaks, I immediately put on my headphone, I start talking all these other languages to get her out of my field of vision. But they don't really get anywhere creatively, I guess that's what you're saying. But so then, how does these protocols of experience translate to the experimental novel? So it's a literary way of using these, but in a creative sense, he's more or less saying in certain psychotic things like you just stop, or in a political sense. And then what are the points of reference there that allow you to move on and not just get stuck in the repetitive points of reference that just control your neurosis or psychosis, but don't really allow you to move on? I guess that was. You don't know?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
And I guess the question would be, there seems to be a continuum. There are times when Artaud seems to be less literary and more crazy,
Right.
And there are some people whose degeneration into this compromises their creative abilities. What all that Deleuze says is that he's he's trapped in the situation and unable to do anything other than to keep reiterating his familial position. Whereas Kafka is able to, he isn't all the time talking about Kafka, he is able to use this to move beyond and do something creative. And it's a good question. How does creativity work? How do neurotic, crazy artists manage somehow to make something worthwhile? I don't know. Arkady, you have a
I think here is one of the areas where the French nuance of experience and experiment becomes tricky, because you could say in English, right, that the protocol of experiment is different from the protocol of experience. Because it's in a creative work, you deal with protocol of experiments, which is open, set, could always be redefined in the process of experimentation, because the results are not predictable. I mean, the essence of scientific experiment is in the fact that you can have a protocol for setting up the experiment, but you cannot predict the outcome. That's really the essence of this type of experimentation, and it seems in French, and it's, by the way, it's true even in English, until in the late 19th, early 20th century, the word experience used to be used in science, at least by some scientists.
Yeah, it is.
So I think that's one of the areas that actually the creative protocols, and I think Artaud, of course, is a very interesting case, because he has both protocols. He operates within both protocols, and sometimes it's really quite remarkable. There's a big exhibit in Paris on Artaud and Van Gogh, in which Artaud writes this essay virtually from the madhouse, and you can say, well, how under these conditions he can write an essay which is completely within the protocol of creative experiment, as opposed to the protocol of experience. And that's why there are all these ambivalent notions, including schizophrenia. As I said, Judge Schreber is the opposite case, in which case what you say is he is the protocol of experience versus the protocol of experiment. And it may be that Deleuze later on in 1993 is not entirely happy with the word protocol.
Right. Well, he
Because
does say
in an experiment you change protocols, which I think Wolfson is really not quite changing his protocol.
Well, there is procedure that becomes the word, and protocol is the bad one. But that's I don't find it before that, 1993. And I don't know how serious he is at sitting on that particular choice of words as opposed to the distinction itself. I don't know, because for so long he didn't seem to have any problem with this notion of protocol and as posséder and opération, programme, all these
But
other.
it's not that it's not, the word is used that often, actually. It's part of your talk that it's a relatively rare use.
Yeah, it is. Right.
So it's not that, it doesn't seem to be like something like a kind of concept, like
No,
the
no.
body without organ, line of flight, etc. It seems to be.
Right. If it were, I wouldn't have a talk. This is the kind of scholarly, nitpicking, library kind of, I noticed this little thing in this text here. The pedantic side of my nature. But still, it would seem to me that there is this whole question of the extent, what it is you never know what the results are going to be, and at every point you evaluate. And you see, one of my arguments behind this is there's a normative dimension to Deleuze's thought. That is, there is a judgment of what's better and worse. And I agree with Paul Patton that there are some fundamental values that Deleuze implicitly holds to, like equality, justice, there's one other that he mentions in one of his essays. And that in his remarks on Antoni Negri to his judges, it's very clear he is saying what you're doing is unjust. And there is, and so it's not like there is no normative dimension, it's just that it's not fixed. It's much more kind of, well, it's an evaluation of the situation. And so I would say, in any kind of protocol experience or experiential experiment or whatever, there comes the moment of assessment. And that is, has something new emerged? And clearly, in the case of Wolfson, nothing ever emerges.
Yeah,
he just keeps staying around his mother, and he keeps. One of the interesting things Deleuze does say there is, Wolfson had the radio and put the headphones in, and Deleuze says he was the inventor of the Walkman. Wolfson, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But you know, when is the question to me in the case of, say, Artaud is, when does something come out that has new possibilities? When does it spin in, the void and just feed back into whatever? When does it become useful? And of course, he doesn't know. And that's where I think, Deleuze doesn't really have a theory of the reader, of reception and how the reader fits in. It's almost entirely a theory of creation from the artist's perspective. But that is an interesting, to my mind, issue of how others use what comes out of the experimentation. Yes?
First, thank you all very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. As we've talked about these different ideas of protocols of experience and experimentation, locating these points to sort of disassemble and reassemble in new ways, I was wondering if there are any points in either literature or philosophy that resist this process of experimentation, that perhaps maybe exist beyond our ability to disassemble and reassemble, or if everything is kind of open and fair game to these protocols of experience.
You're asking the wrong guy.
Okay.
I come out of comparative literature, and let me ask our philosophers over here. Can you answer this question?
Our audience.
I'm thinking the things that popped into mind are like the Lacanian real, or maybe the Kantian, the categorical imperative, or if there are certain things that.
Well, but the real would be relating to that which could resist. I mean, I think in any activity, I think we get a little bit differently because in the Quran usually in Shelley's Julian and Madala, which is a great poem about the case of somebody's madness, right? And then Shelley has this incredible line in which a language was in measure, crazy language, but which in measure we call poesy, right? So that borderline, when you see the linguistics dimension of Wilson does, right? They could become poetic experiment. If you go to some of the Russian futurists like Lebnikov and opposition is I would say always involved practice or procedure of these things. However, it will always be resistant by the real insofar that it, the literary practice or any creative practice, including science or philosophy, etc., they're different but they're also interactive, would have to involve the practice of protocols or procedures of experimentation, while I think the experience could actually dissolve some of that, but then it will not be structured. I think part of the argument here that these are all structured activities. They're not chaotic activities, they're complex order activities. So I think my answer would be, the short answer would be no. As the literary practice is concerned, we always involve interplay of protocol structures, etc. However, there would be intervals in which it would not apply, simply because the real could intervene in such a way in the process. But I don't think you can really ever eliminate that play or practice of these things which constitute a protocol of procedures for which you do so. You can invent new procedures, you can do that, but I don't think it's possible to dispense in any this type of creative activity, or even in a crazy activity, because on an adverse side they involve fixed protocols. Interesting. And Lacan, well, Lacan, the real is very different from is a symbolic or imaginary, which are activities.
The real is
already
impossible.
there.
So-
Yeah.
So just to maybe like reword your answer. So if it's been symbolized, it is in fact open to this process of experimentation, and all literature and art is.
Well,
in
not
some-
in the symbolic that
not
much
symbolic,
actually.
you know.
In imaginary probably, right? But
Well,
not that much
if
in
you want to
Lacan
do it in,
symbolic.
if you want to do it in
But that's why there is an opposition in Deleuze and
terms,
Guattari.
Deleuze and Guattari say it's
Yeah.
real.
Yes, schizophrenia
You know, because
versus
I mean,
the
Lacan
symbolic.
says the real is impossible. And the first thing they say in Oedipus is no. The real is directly, it is desiring production. And, you know, and one of their points all over and over again is it's not something that we can't, that has to be symbolized or rendered in terms of the imaginary. No, that's sort of, to use the wrong term, superstructure, but rather that is all immanent within a real that we are operating in directly. So, which sounds counterintuitive by Lacanian. I can't decide which I like. But it sounds like that you're not satisfied with the answer.
Well, it's just things to think about.
It's good to keep it in
Thank you
house,
both for your responses.
So that if you're dissatisfied, you have somebody here at your institution.
And I'm more familiar with Lacanian than the Deleuzian, so.
Well, you can put it different. They can say there's a topological issue. In Lacan, real is always outside, always in some degree outside of a symbolic or imaginary practice. But in Deleuze, in Guattari, schizophrenic practice, which is connected to the real, and the real becomes the immanent.
Okay.
Yeah, so right.
Yeah.
We have time for like one more, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
In Life and Literature, the first essay of critical and clinical, Deleuze creates 4 concepts or elements of experimentation. And I think they're stuttering, fabulation.
Becoming is the first one.
Okay. Yeah, I say becoming last.
Fabulation, oh, you want to do that one?
Oh, go ahead.
That's the first one he mentions.
Mhm.
And then he has fabulation, and then he has the stuttering, and then he has audition and vision, auditions and visions, which seems to be a subdivision of stuttering in a way, and in a way not. And that's very, very late. I think you get something about being a seer of voyant. But the notion of audition, vision, itself, I don't think occurs before that essay. Is that what you?
Not that I know.
Yeah. And I was intrigued by that notion, and I tried to write about it, and I'm not certain. Well, you had a question about it?
Yeah. I was going to mention becoming's line, the various becomings that he discusses and that you alluded to. The one that he mentioned, the main goal of the writer would be becoming imperceptible.
Yeah.
And I have such a hard time understanding what that could mean in terms of when I'm reading, say, Kafka. But you were helpful when you mentioned the K function. Would the K function be an example of becoming imperceptible? Otherwise, how would you discuss that?
I always go to a very specific passage in the becoming plateau where Deleuze and Guattari talk about the camouflage fish. To me, that's when it makes sense to me. They start by talking about Kafka and the knight of faith who reaches a point where he looks like every other bourgeois out there. And when he reaches that point, then he becomes imperceptible. But Deleuze and Guattari say that the camouflage fish is a fish whose markings do not at all conform to the body of the fish, nor to the surrounding. In some ways, it's like army camo, but it's just this. They say abstract lines, such that the fish disappears or becomes imperceptible in its environment. But it says what the fish is doing is worlding, is Felmund, is making a world, and that's what being imperceptible to me means, is reaching such a point that one is, I guess, so much becoming with everything that one is cosmic and no longer even molecular, but just abstract lines. And if this is purely a kind of poetic evocation, yeah, I don't know exactly how I would have this happen, other than it reminds me of what Cézanne said when painting, and I see if I can get it right. Madini is a guy that Deleuze uses, and he jumps on this thing, and Deleuze uses it in the Francis Bacon book and also in What is Philosophy, where he says, I am the poor nature, or rather there is, the idea is, I am already in the canvas, or rather in the thing that I am looking at. It is where the human is so dissolved that there is no differentiation anymore. But it's not like fusion. It's more like I and the and the chaosmos I am going to paint are already there together. And then the second, that's system. The diastole or diastole system, I don't forget which one. And then is the stubborn geometry, when you start to have a forming that happens. And in the third movement, when there is this splendor of a kind of trend, what, I don't want to say Hegelian fusion, those two, but a kind of being in the painting as part of the architecture that is emerging. Usually in these cases, I just go with my intuition, and I can get a sense of fusion. Being in it but not it. But to me, that's sort of what I would think of as being imperceptible. I don't know. Do you have a better idea?
That's beautiful.
I don't know. We have time for no more questions if that was the last one.
Yeah, I think.
As I was saying to a couple of people before this, when you stand up and talk, give lectures, you can talk forever and it seems like time just flies. When you sit down, the seat gets so hard. After 20 minutes, and after 30 minutes, you start thinking, I need to look around. 40 minutes, this is going on forever. So, I understand. I'm always ready to keep talking, but all things, good or bad, must come to an end. So are we done?
Yes, thank you very much.